Chapter 16. I nodded truthfully. He wants a divorce. If I tell him of the baby, he might think that I am using it to keep us married. Jared raised a brow in question. But he already knows of it. What will you do? I was taken aback by his question. Trying to sound him out, Elle asked, will Ashton want a child? I am not Ashton, replied Jared. He placed his phone in his pocket as he glanced at me. But Ashton is 30. There's no reason for him to refuse one. With that, he placed his hands in his pockets and left. Does that mean that Ashton will want me to have the baby? It seemed that my optimism was premature. When Rebecca barged into my room, I was still hooked onto the end drip. She rushed in rashly as she gripped my throat. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Why did you get pregnant? Scarlett, you killed my baby. I won't let your baby live. As she was holding me in a chokehold, I couldn't breathe. All I could do was try to pry her hands off my neck. She had obviously lost control of herself. I won't let you give birth to a baby. You won't use the baby to tie Ash to you. She declared viciously. She was petite and frail, but right now, my resistance was futile in the face of her strength. I managed to choke out a few words. Kill me. And you will pay. She sneered and tightened her grip. I'll get to kill both mother and child. It's worth it. Rebecca, what are you doing? A man's voice rang from the door. Upon hearing the familiar voice, Rebecca stiffened at once. The menace in her gaze faded away. As tears streamed down her eyes, she collapsed onto the ground at Ashton's sudden appearance. Ashton caught her in time while I regained my freedom again. I immediately gasped for air. It took us a while to calm down. Rebecca was sobbing pitifully in Ashton's arms by now. Ash, you promised me that you wouldn't allow other women to give birth to your child. You gave me your word. I stared at the loving couple calmly. The sight of them made my stomach churn. Ashton glanced at me coolly as he patted Rebecca's back to console her. Stop crying. You've just recovered, he asked, his voice deep and resounding. Rebecca looked up at him. She wiped her tears away and inquired, Ash, you won't allow her to give birth to the baby, right? I stared directly at Ashton, waiting for his answer anxiously. Ashton couldn't even be bothered to look at me. Instead, he gazed at Rebecca tenderly as he swept her tears away. Stop it, Rebecca. I sighed in relief inwardly at his answer. At least he isn't going to ask me to abort the baby. No. Rebecca grew emotional once again. Her tears started gushing out uncontrollably as she tugged at Ashton's shirt pitifully. Ash, you promised me that you would take care of me. After my brother died, you were the only one who I could depend on. Sniffling, she pointed at me. If she gives birth to your child, you won't divorce her. Right. Will you go back on your word to take care of me forever? You'll have your own family, but I have nothing and I don't want to end up alone. Chapter 17. Rebecca couldn't stop herself from sobbing like a child who had been abandoned by her mother. Ashton pulled her into his arms. Rebecca, you're not alone. You won't be alone. Calm down, will you? Don't let her give birth to the baby, please, Rebecca begged, her eyes swollen from all of her sobbing. Ash, please don't let her give birth to the baby. Do you want me to die? She sounded so determined. Fury flashed across Ashton's glare. Rebecca, stop idle. Rebecca gave him a sudden shove as she grabbed a knife meant for the fruits and slashed her wrist. Her actions were swift. Ashton and I had no idea that Rebecca would go to this extreme. Hence, the man panicked as he picked her up to bring her to the Rebecca clung to the bed's railing, refusing to loosen her grip. She gazed at Ashton intently as she repeated, Don't let her give birth to the baby. I was shocked. Why is she so determined on this? Before Ashton could reply, I spoke up. Rebecca, don't worry. I won't. Trailing of, I took a deep breath to keep the pain at bay. Elle won't give birth to the baby. Scarlett'll, Ashton roared angrily. If you don't send her to the she might die. Imagine how bad you'll feel. I threw forth bitterly. Pursing his lips, Ashton gazed at me darkly before he left with Rebecca in his arms. I was left alone in the ward. The pool of blood on the floor, which evidently belonged to Rebecca, was glaringly obvious. My fever had subsided, but the doctors told me to get another IV drip. I wasn't in the mood to stay, so I refused as I discharged myself from the hospital. After a night of heavy rain, the air smelled rather refreshing. I didn't go back to the villa as I soon made my way to Fuller Corporation instead. At the company's lobby, the receptionist hurriedly approached me. Ms. Stovall, drive. Ludwig's wife is waiting for you in your office. She has been there for around 15 minutes. I inclined my head as I pressed the button on the elevator. Tell Stacy to prepare some gifts for Mrs. Ludwig to show her our sincerity. The receptionist nodded. After entering the elevator, I called Jared. He picked up after 2 rings and answered. Scarlett. I was surprised to hear him calling my name. Frowning, Elle asked, are you free tonight? Can we meet up? He seemed astounded at my request. Sure, he replied after a short pause. Let me know the time and location. I will send the details to you later. I had reached my destination, so I hung up and sent the details to Jared by text. Then, I went to the bathroom to touch up my makeup before I returned to my office. I had been married to Ashton for 2 years. I couldn't get him to fall in love with me. But I had achieved considerable success at work. I was no longer the inexperienced office worker. Now, I was capable enough to deal with various problems at work. In my office, an elegantly dressed lady was sitting on the sofa, reading something on her phone. I knocked twice on the half-closed door before I entered. Mrs. Ludwig, I am sorry to have made you wait. The traffic was really bad. I greeted her with a smile. Martha stood up at the sight of me. No worries. I just arrived too. She was smiling pleasantly. After a brief exchange, Martha went straight to the point. Mrs. Fuller, I am sorry to disturb you at work. You know that Caleb signed a contract with Fuller Corporation earlier, right? Nevertheless, since the horrible thing has happened, can you help us in convincing Mick Fuller to delay the completion? Doing that will help Caleb and I get a little breathing room. Chapter 18. Fuller Corporation's collaboration with the hospital was a project under the National Fund. As a construction and trade company, the collaboration with the hospital was under the company's construction business. I was in charge of this project, as ordered by Ashton. Caleb was in fact Martha's husband. We had both signed a contract, stipulating that full payment should have to be made before the completion of the construction. Unfortunately, Caleb had used the money from the fund elsewhere, so we couldn't complete the construction. To simply put it, Caleb couldn't pay the balance to Fuller Corporation on time as stipulated by the contract. After listening to Martha's plea, I forced out a SML. Mrs. Ludwig, you know very well that Ashton and I aren't that close. It's a huge sum of money. Ashton is known for his thoroughness at work. If something happens, I won't be able to explain it to him. Martha panicked instantly. She thought about it and suggested, will 1 week do? Please extend the deadline by a week. When Caleb pays the balance, we'll thank you personally. I could have easily agreed, but I chose to utter Mrs. Ludwig, Fuller Corporation isn't an SME. We have strict rules regarding funding. If I help Dr. Ludwig, I have to bear responsibility. Unless, I paused and glanced at her. She immediately asked, unless what? It was as if I was her last ray of hope. I hesitated before answering. Unless I have a reason to delay my work. Before she could answer, I added, there's a perfect excuse available now. What is it? Martha's grip on her glass tightened. I need drive Ludwig's help in arranging for an CBGN to tend to me. I'm going to abort my baby. Martha was shocked to hear my words. Mrs. Fuller, you're pregnant. I nodded. I'm 6 weeks along. Why are you aborting your child at this stage? Does Mr. Fuller know about your pregnancy? Martha was confused. You've been married for some time. The child has arrived at the perfect time. I gave her a faint smile. Ashton and I aren't ready yet. I paused briefly before adding, Elle can use the excuse to delay the completion. Please inform Dr. Ludwig of my request. Does Mr. Fuller know about this? She repeated unconvincingly. I nodded. He does. Well, that's too bad. She sighed. That was it. Stacy prepared some supplements for Martha before she left. Go to the president's office and ask Joseph to hand me the divorce agreement that Ashton drafted earlier. I told her after Martha was gone. Stacy was dumbfounded. Mrs. Stovall. Chapter 19. Stacy had been with me for about 2 years, and she was well aware of the things that happened between Ashton and me. Knitting her brows, she said, if you agree to the divorce, you know old Mr. Fuller would be disappointed with your decision, right? Besides, if you agree to it right now, the shares which old me Fuller had transferred to you will belong to Mr. Fuller. Mrs. Stovall, the odds will not be in your favor if you make this decision. I was well aware of her concerns. After looking at the time, I noticed that it was already quite late. Hence, I did not care to explain things further and said, I have my own plans. Please fetch me the documents. I need to head out later. Stacy stomped out of the office when she noticed that I did not pay heed to her efficiency. Elle only had to wait at the staircase for a short while before she fetched the things that I requested. She still had not given up on talking me out of the divorce. Mrs. Stovall, it's really not wise to sign the divorce papers now. Enough. I interrupted her before she could finish her sentence. After getting into the lift, I looked into her eyes and said, don't worry about me and focus on your work. I know what to do. She parted her lips to say something, but the elevator door already closed. I started my car after I reached the parking lot and drove straight to the place where Jared and I had agreed to meet. South Bay was a restaurant where people from the upper echelon would frequent. Despite its obscure location, the dishes here were exquisite. Since I had made a reservation before coming, I went straight to my table after I had arrived at South Bay. However, I was surprised to see that Jared had arrived ahead of time. He was dressed rather casually, exuding a classy demeanor as he sat by the window. He tapped his slender fingers against the table in a carefree manner. Sorry for being late, I said as I took a seat right opposite him and called for the waiter to take my order. He was initially staring blankly out the window. At the sight of me, he lifted his brows. And a hint of smile fleeted across his face. How could I be late on a date with a pretty girl? It was actually quite rare to catch him with a smile. I pushed the menu toward him. Has anyone ever told you that you look really gentle when you smile? He raised an eyebrow at my comment and gestured me to order from the menu first. His almond-shaped eyes narrowed slightly as he looked into my eyes. You're the first person to say that. I merely smiled and did not comment further. After skimming through the menu, ordered a few dishes that I thought he would enjoy. After handing the menu back to the waiter, I sipped on my water. He did not say anything and merely smiled as he looked at me. Puzzled at his demeanor, I put down the glass of water and asked, "Is there something on my face?" His lips curved into a smile. It was apparent that he was in a good mood. "It's my first time dining with my best friend's woman. It feels." He paused and grinned from ear to ear. "Well, I'd have to say it feels quite great. Birds of a feather flock together." Naturally, the people around Ashton would not be as easy to manipulate. I did not doubt his words, nor did I ruminate over his undertone. Seeing that he was not beating around the bush, I returned the favor by asking him directly, "If something comes up and I need your help, I believe that you would offer me a helping hand." He raised a brow and leaned back into his seat. "What kind of help are we talking about here?" "Get me some medicine for women recovering from a miscarriage." He frowned upon hearing my request. "Only this?" I nodded. "Well, you have a good reputation. So is that a yes or no for the medicine?" Chapter 20. With a frown, Jared stared straight into my eyes with his obsidian deep-set ones. He was contemplating whether I was being truthful. I did not fret. I sat quietly as he tried to gauge me. After some time, he finally spoke. "Sure. Thank you. Drive. Crest. It was always a pleasure to deal with smart people. Just throw them a look and they would have gotten the gist of it." After the waiter had served our food, he shot a glance at me again. "Has Ms. Stovall always downplayed your brilliance this way?" I chuckled at his remark. "Oh, you flatter me. It's just a small trick to protect myself. Besides, Ashton and I are really not meant for each other anyway. This is a really bad time to have the baby." He had a few bites, seemingly pleased with my answer. "When do you plan to leave?" I was taken aback and locked eyes with him. My plan was to deal with the baby and force Ashton. As for leaving J City, I really had no inkling as to where I should be headed at the moment. He had even gotten the last step of my plan correct. I paused for a moment, putting down the utensils in my hands. "Maybe in 2 months' time. I haven't decided on the place. Why don't you consider Q City? I think you'd fit in perfectly there." He put down his utensils and wiped the corners of his mouth. Maybe he was done eating. Actually found Q City to be a good suggestion and nodded. Maybe should consider that. Even though Q City was modest in comparison with J City, the pace of life there was slower. If I were to choose someplace where I would spend the rest of my life, Q City was actually a viable option. You was supposed to foot the bill, but he was one step ahead of me. We walked out of the restaurant together and I said, "I owe you one. It's going to be my treat next time." "Well, I hope you would treat me at Q City then." I was at a loss for words and merely smiled. It was getting late and I should be heading home. He suddenly asked when he reached his car. "So the surgery has been scheduled?" "Yes, tomorrow." I turned around and replied. Why dwell on the course of our actions if the decision has already been made? "Does Ashton know?" "No, and I don't intend to let him know about it anyway." He frowned, albeit making no comment. After I started my car, I noticed that he was in a lane right beside his own car. Figured it was best not to comment about it. I drove back to the villa right after. It was a 10-minute drive. I parked the car downstairs and did not get off as I took the divorce papers that Stacy handed over to me. A wave of bitterness washed over me. I thought that I would only sign the divorce papers should Ashton ever put a knife to my neck. Never would I have imagined that one day I would willingly sign and hand this over to him. Ashton had always been liberal with the terms in the event of a divorce. He had promised me the villa and the yearly dividends from the Fuller Corporation shares. I could not help but be amused as I looked at the terms of the divorce. Maybe all along he had been thinking that I had only gotten together with him because of all these, and that there would absolutely no reason for me to refuse to sign the papers. If he had gui, it was a 10-minute drive. I parked the car downstairs and did not get off as I took the divorce papers that Stacy handed over to me. A wave of bitterness washed over me. I thought that I would only sign the divorce papers should Ashton ever put a knife to my neck. Never would I have imagined that one day I would willingly sign and hand this over to him. Ashton had always been liberal with the terms in the event of a divorce. He had promised me the villa and the yearly dividends from the Fuller Corporation shares. I could not help but be amused as I looked at the terms of the divorce. Maybe all along he had been thinking that I had only gotten together with him because of all these, and that there would absolutely no reason for me to refuse to sign the papers. If he had given me what he allegedly thought I was after. After looking at the papers for some time, I finally penned down my signature. Back in the villa, the living room was all dark. I changed into slippers and reached out to turn on the lights. To my surprise, there was a man sitting in the living room. He stared impassively at me with his deep dark eyes. I could not discern what was on his mind. I looked at him and said slowly, "Why didn't you turn on the lights? Have you had dinner yet?" He did not answer my questions. "Where have you been?" His tone was icy, and there was a hint of displeasure in it. "I just went to the office." I headed right into the kitchen afterward and said, "I'll make something for you." Well, I guess he wouldn't have a hearty appetite after what Rebecca had done at the hospital today. Why should I care? He was about to leave anyway. What did it have to do with me if he were to starve to death? I thought it was best to split on good terms. He had been someone whom I cared about for such a long time anyway. It would be in our best interests to leave behind at least some sweet memories. I suddenly felt a chill down my spine after I was done cooking. I turned around and was greeted by his cold, hard gaze. "What's the matter?" There was only contempt in his eyes whenever he would look at me. Somehow, it felt different today. It felt complicated. I did not know how to deal with it and panicked. He did not reply, and I took that as because he did not feel like talking to me. So, I kept my mouth shut and cooked ramen for him. We don't have much at home, only eggs. You'd have to make do with that. I turned around and went upstairs to wash up. However, he suddenly spoke. "Sadhu, we make do with our marriage too." Stumped, I felt a searing pain in my chest. I would have chosen to keep quiet some other time. However, today was different. My eyes went red at his words. "So what? Big deal. Haven't we been doing that for almost 2 years now?" Ashton Fuller. "I'm saying yes to the divorce." I took out the divorce papers in my bag and put them right in front of him. I felt bitterness creeping up inside of me. "I have signed it. You take a look at it and put down your signature too. Let's set a time and head to the Civil Affairs Bureau to make things official." I breathed a sigh of relief after getting those words off my chest. Looking at his handsome, chiseled face, I spoke. "Don't worry about the baby. I will deal with it in a manner that both you and Rebecca will find satisfactory." One had to bear the consequences of one's actions. A hint of fury fleeted across his face, but it went unnoticed as I turned around to head upstairs. This may well be the last time we're having such a conversation in the villa. I felt a sudden grip on my wrist. Care to explain more? The fury in his tone was apparent. I knew he was getting mad, but still, I did not turn around. I tried hard to suppress the swelling emotions and said, I will get it done so that it won't affect Rebecca. Scarlett Stovall. His grip tightened on my wrist as his fury reached a tipping point. What's your plan, huh? To divorce me? To abort the baby? What's next? Are you going to leave the city? What other choice do I have? The tears welled up in my eyes, streamed down my cheeks despite my best efforts at holding them in. What else could I do? Ashton, haven't you always wished for me to agree to this? You've always wanted me to stay as far away from you as possible, right? What exactly am I doing wrong here? Isn't this what you've wished for? His gaze darkened. The iciness was even more apparent. You think you're really smart, huh? He snorted as he pinched my chin with his slender fingers. I tried to shrug him off, but he pinched down harder. The two of us were so close that I could feel his breath against my skin. That is my baby. You do not have the right to determine whether it lives or dies. One don't have the right. I chuckled, enunciating myself. So does Rebecca have a say in this? Stovall, you're playing with fire here. He narrowed his eyes at me, his gaze threatening. Chapter 21. He let go of his hand, not exerting any force. However, I felt a searing pain extending from my chin all the way to my heart. Even my toes were curling from the pain. I had not yet recovered from getting drenched in the rain. The sudden confrontation and him abruptly letting go of me made me slump into his embrace. His strong arms from the years of fitness training held me steady. I could clearly feel his muscles flexing as I leaned into his embrace. My energy was running low, and I did not wish to be entangled in a fight with him. So, I closed my eyes. Well, someone's gotten bolder. You even know how to play dead now. His mocking voice rang in my ears. The anger in his tone was still apparent. He tapped my cheeks repeatedly, and it was by no means gentle. However, I did not feel well and kept my eyes closed. Perhaps he had regretted his actions. He carried me and brought me back to the bedroom after noticing that I did not respond. After he put me on the bed, there were no discernible movements. I thought he just could not be bothered with me. However, after some time I heard him calling Jared. It sounded like he was asking Jared to come take a look at me. So, he's not that heartless after all. After about 10 minutes, I fell asleep from the drowsiness. Still in a daze, I heard Jared talking. Ashton, you'd better think how you want to deal with the baby. It's getting late. You'd better head back and get some rest. Ashton sounded quite exasperated. Sometimes I actually pitied Jared. He was a renowned doctor after all. How did he actually feel about being at Ashton's every beck and call? I was all tuckered out from running around the whole day, so I fell asleep for good. In the middle of the night, I could feel someone scooping me in an embrace. I tried to open my eyes but to no avail. I was just too tired. The next day, after I woke up, Ashton was no longer at the villa. It did not require a genius to guess that he had gone to visit Rebecca. I had made an appointment with Caleb the day before and headed straight to the hospital after washing up. Martha had been waiting at the hospital entrance after she had gotten the news about my appointment today. At the sight of me, she asked in a worried tone, "Are you sure about aborting the baby? Aren't you going to discuss it with Mr. Fuller first?" I knew she was just looking out for me. Smiling, I entered the hospital together with her. "It's going to be okay. Don't worry about me." Caleb had arranged a doctor for the surgery. I did all the basic prior checkups for the surgery. After getting the green light, I got into an operation theater. Martha was worried sick, and she had not given up on advising me against the abortion. "Mrs. Fuller, even though you're young, this is going to take a toll on your body. Have you thought it through? I nodded. It was time for the surgery. I patted her arm and comforted her. It's going to be all right. I followed a nurse into the operating theater. The doctor was a middle-aged woman, and she tried to calm my nerves. Mrs. Fuller, we're going to go with general anesthesia here. You're going to be unconscious right after, and there's going to be no pain. Don't worry. I nodded. Everything was just as she said. It did not take me long before I drifted off. I was on a hospital bed when I woke up. Ashton was giving me the dead eyes again. His thin lips were pursed. The temperature in the room and his cold, hard gaze were sending chills down my spine. The hint of fury in his eyes did not help either. I had never seen him like this and my heart sank. Subconsciously, I reached out to him but he flung my hand away forcefully. I parted my lips to say something but could not bring myself to say it. Averting my gaze from his death glare, I closed my eyes and decided to keep quiet. Scarlett, you're really heartless. He turned around to leave afterward. This was the best way for things to end. I sighed as I watched his silhouette getting out of my sight. Aren't you afraid of Mr. Fuller hating you for this? A deep voice came from the door. It was Caleb. He had my medical records in his hands, checking on my condition. I mean, he is the child's father after all. You can fool him once but you can't fool him forever. The cat will be out of the bag sooner or later. I smiled and sat right up on the hospital bed. Taking the medical records from his hand, I glanced at my stats. Everything seemed fine to me. No more next time. Thank you for keeping up the act up for me. I prepared to get off the bed after keeping my medical records. However, I was stopped by Caleb. Why don't you keep your story consistent? When have you ever seen a woman up and running not even half an hour after having an abortion? Well, he was right. I lay back down on the bed and said, well, Ashton is a careful person, and he's likely to send someone to check on my medical records, as well as to keep an eye on me. I'd appreciate your help then, Dr. Ludwig. His wrinkled face curled into a smile. Helplessly, he said, youngsters these days. Why do you guys have to come up with things like these? But since I've agreed to help you out with this, I'll make sure the rest of the story ties together. I nodded and thanked him. I believe that you will come up with something for Martha too. It was best not to let too many people in on the truth. Chapter 22. Caleb smiled and said nothing before leaving. I lay on the bed for the whole morning. After the doctor came in to brief me on things to take note of and taking my medicine, I was discharged from the hospital. Stacy was waiting for me at the hospital entrance. She helped me into the car as I looked at her and said, please come up with something so that Rebecca knows I've had an abortion. She nodded, started the car and sent me back to the villa. Ashton was not around. I sent Stacy back to the office. There was nothing much Elle could do since I had just been discharged from the hospital. So, I fell asleep on the bed. However, before I drifted off, I heard the sound of an engine humming downstairs. I walked over to the balcony and saw Ashton and Jared. Just as I thought, Ashton did not even cast me a second glance. He was just calling Jared here to check on me. I got on the bed. Jared came in with his kit. At the sight of me, he tightened his brows. He motioned for me to let him check my pulse. Have you brought the medicine I asked for? He looked at me and said, your cover-up plan is brilliant. I kept mum and he checked my pulse, taking some medicine out of his kit, and said, these are all medicine to keep the baby healthy. If you eat these regularly and there's no mishap, the baby should be just fine. Jared went downstairs afterward. I swapped out the medicine that Jared gave me with the ones I brought back from the hospital. Then, I lay on the bed again. I had to take at least a week to fully recover from the miscarriage. There was no problem with dragging Caleb's project for a week. However, It would feel like hell to stay at the villa for one whole week. I thought Ashton Fury would subside after he met up with Rebecca, and that it would take him only a while to move on from it all. What I did not know was the fight between him and I was just about to start. There were not many people in the villa. Ashton did not come back because he was still mad about the abortion. Well, I was actually quite pleased not having him around. I stayed in for the whole day to keep up with my act, and would ask for Stacy help when I needed anything. Soon, it was already afternoon. After Stacy placed everything in the fridge, she walked over to my side and said, "Mrs. Stovall, the balance payment from Medwin Hospital has been pending for a number of days, and the finance department has called in a few times to check on it. Do you think you should make a call to Dr. Ludwig?" I had a few bites of durian but could not stand the fruit's strong smell and threw it into the trash can. Stacy was still standing beside me. I gestured for her to take a seat, wiped my hands, and said, "How many days has it been pending at Dr. Ludwig's end?" "About 2 to 3 days. She paused before continuing. "It's not really about how long the payment has been pending. It's just that the amount involved is quite considerable. The money has been earmarked for a new market development project of the company. Now that the payment has been delayed, it might affect the profit of the company for the next quarter." I nodded. Fuller Corporation's cash flow had been very dynamic. Any delay from our partners will, to a certain degree, affect our operations. The amount pending on Dr. Ludwig's end was quite huge. Even if the money had not been earmarked for any investment, it would still make a handsome profit just by sitting in the bank alone. I paused for a moment before saying, "Dr. Ludwig is a man of his word. I've been staying at home these few days and this has been thrown to the back of my mind. I will bear responsibility for this payment. Just give a heads up to the finance department. I will deal with this as soon as I'm back in the office." "Yes, Mrs. Stovall." She rose from her seat and headed for the kitchen to make me some food. I looked at my phone and there was a text from Martha. "Mrs. Fuller, are you feeling better? Caleb has managed to settle his cash flow situation. We really need to thank you for this." It seemed like the problem had been resolved at Caleb's end. So, I could technically head right back to work. After replying to her message, I gave Caleb a call to set a time for him to sign the project completion agreement after he had cleared his payments. Stacy was done cooking by the time I made an appointment with Caleb. She had something on and had to leave, and so I did not insist for her to stay. "I think I have almost fully recovered, so you can stay in the office tomorrow. I've made an appointment with Dr. Ludwig, and I will get to the bottom of it tomorrow." She was worried as she looked at me. "Are you sure you're all right? Don't you have to at least rest for about 2 weeks after a miscarriage?" "It's only been a few days, Mrs. Stovall." I smiled. "I look fine, right? Besides, if I don't settle this thing with Dr. Ludwig, this would have to drag on for a long time. How much losses would the company have to bear by then? By that time I won't be only getting dead eyes from Ashton. There was no abortion in the first place. Things would go haywire if I just sit here and do nothing all day. Besides, my belly would only be getting bigger with each passing day. I would have to deal with a bigger problem if I did not draw the line with Ashton as soon as possible. So, my only choice was to hurry up and settle everything before I could leave J City for good." Stacy sighed and said, "All right, but you have to take good care of your health. There was no abortion in the first place. Things would go haywire if I just sit here and do nothing all day. Besides, my belly would only be getting bigger with each passing day. I would have to deal with a bigger problem if I did not draw the line with Ashton as soon as possible. So, my only choice was to hurry up and settle everything before I could leave J City for good." Stacy sighed and said, All right, but you have to take good care of your health. Chapter 23. I sent Stacy away and returned to the dining table. Eating alone was no fun, but it was already late and I couldn't be bothered to head out. After a few bites of dinner, I returned to my bedroom. Ashton wasn't coming back, nor did I have much else to do, so I spent the past 2 days reading at home and searching the internet for some houses in Q City. If I were to live in Q City, I'll have to find at least a place that was decent enough for my child and me. A sudden phone call made me stop in my tracks. It was Macy. The moment I picked up, my ears rang before I could even speak. You damned woman. Did you abort the child? It had only been a few days. Yeah. How did you find out? Macy went ballistic. How did I find out? You have the nerve to still ask me that. Do you even consider me your friend? How could you have done such a thing without even telling me anything? There was no refuting this woman when she unleashed her fury. I clutched my slightly throbbing head. Delaying it would only cause more problems, so I took care of it ASAP. I wanted to tell you about it, but you've been busy these days, so I figured I'd wait 2 more days. Don't give me that bullshit. I'm not against abortion, but don't you need someone to care for you after the surgery? You never said a word to me about it. What if something happens to you? Macy was so frantic that she didn't mince her words. My heart felt warm knowing that she was worried about me. After letting her give me a long lecture, I finally decided to speak. I plan to divorce Ashton, Mary. I might leave J City after that. Do you want to leave too? I chose not to tell her about the child for now. Here wasn't much of a point in doing so by now. Still, I had to tell her about my intentions to move. Macy was now in J City because of me. After all, she'd surely cut me off if I were to leave without a word. The woman fell silent for a long while before asking, "When will you leave? Where do you want to move to?" "Sometime within these few months. I think Q City's not bad. I'd like to live there." "Okay, I got it," she replied immediately. To my surprise, Macy said nothing more. Thinking we had nothing else to talk about, I was about to hang up when she suddenly spoke up again. "Come get your man. He's totally wasted." I froze. "Ashton. What other man would you have apart from him?" I was at a loss for words. Why did Ashton get himself drunk? After ending the call, I packed a few things, put on my coat and drove toward Macy's bar. Our bar wasn't too far off from the villa, so it only took me 10 minutes to get there. As usual, Macy was drinking by the counter, and she remarked helplessly upon seeing me. "He's upstairs in the private room. The guy's completely knocked out." I put the car keys into my purse. Why did he come here to drink? How would I know? He's been coming over since 2 days ago, but that hunky assistant of his always took him home before he could get drunk. The assistant isn't here today, though. "That's why your man is wasted," Macy responded with pursed lips as she put her glass down. "You got rid of the child without talking to him about it. What makes you think he'd be in a cheery mood?" I was stunned. Was Ashton really that upset because of the child? I headed up to the 2nd floor and found the room Ashton was in. No one answered after I knocked twice, so I decided to enter anyway. The intense smell of cigarettes and booze wafted into my nostrils the moment I opened the door. I kept the door open, secretly airing out the room a little. Inside the dimly lit room, a man leaned on the sofa with his eyes closed and lips slightly pursed. He didn't seem drunk at all. In fact, he looked like he was just getting some shut-eye. "Ashton." As I called out to him, I spotted several empty bottles of whiskey. There was no way his liver could take all this alcohol. Upon hearing my voice, his eyelashes fluttered as he opened his eyes to gaze at me coldly. Perhaps because I had disrupted his peace, The atmosphere turned chilly in an instant, and the way he looked at me grew increasingly contemptuous by the minute. "Get out," he ordered in a deep voice, his lips parted slightly. Knowing that he didn't wish to see me, I sighed and walked toward him. "You've had too much to drink, Ashton. Let's go home." Yet, the man squinted as a cold smirk appeared on his face. "Home? Is that what I'd call home?" he sneered. I furrowed my brows, feeling my temper getting shorter due to my pregnancy. I would usually put up with his humiliation, but this time, I couldn't help but respond grimly. "Elf, that isn't home, what is it?" "If you don't wish to see me, Ashton, I can always give Rebecca a call and have her come pick you up. Macy has a business to run, so stop giving her a hard time." Suddenly, Ashton grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me onto his lap before wrapping his arms around my waist. Then, he violently shoved a hand down my collar and scoffed, "Home'll never be home as long as you're around. I'd say it's more like an inn." Chapter 24. Ashton grabbed onto me as he finished. Rage boiled within me as I frowned in pain. I pulled his hand out, glaring at him. "Well, if it's nothing but an inn to you, feel free to never come back. Sign the divorce papers and we'll never see each other again." Suddenly, he bit me on the shoulder, causing me to hiss in pain. My tears were on the verge of spilling out. "Oh, so you're going to stay far away from me now that you've gotten the money, the house, and the shares?" Ashton glared at me and let out a cold laugh. "Your love sure is cheap, Scarlett. To think you're taking it all back so easily." My head began to hurt seeing how intoxicated he was. What was I doing? Trying to reason with a drunkard. Suppressing my anger, I softened my tone and held his face. "It's getting late, Ashton. Let's go home, okay?" Ashton stopped talking. He closed his eyes and leaned back into the couch, but still held on to me. Not knowing what he wanted, I paused briefly before suggesting, "If you don't want to come home with me, I'll ask Rebecca to pick you up, okay?" He didn't want to return to the villa anyway. I assumed he had been staying with Rebecca all this while. Refusing to let him disrupt Macy's business, I grabbed my purse and took out my phone, ready to give Rebecca a call. Yet, Ashton snatched my phone before I could even dial Rebecca's number. Crash. He tossed my phone far away. I froze in shock before turning to him. "What the hell do you want, Ashton?" He didn't want to leave with me, yet he refused to let someone else pick him up. Did he intend to die here on his own? "Let's go home," the man spat out coldly as he carried me and began to stagger out of the room. I was utterly frightened. With a child inside of me, I wouldn't even have a chance to regret it if he were to accidentally drop me. Holding onto him tightly, I dared not speak too sternly. "You're drunk, Ashton. Put me down. I can walk on my own. I just had surgery, so it'd be bad if I slipped." Ashton suddenly stilled in place before gazing at me with his pitch-black eyes. Was it to get back at me? I froze, not knowing what he was talking about. "Of course not," I answered while shaking my head. "I love you so much, why would I want to get back at you? Put me down and let's go home, okay?" God. A drunk man was no different from a child. Just when I thought he was up to something again, he put me down to my surprise and cast me a glance. "Let's go home." I had grown tired from nodding at this point. "Okay, let's go," I replied, holding onto him. Not knowing how much he had drunk, I helped the staggering man down to the ground floor. Macy stood by the counter with her arms crossed. "Do you need help?" I shook my head. "Has he paid the bill?" Macy rolled her eyes at me. "Paid the bill? My bar is already practically his now." With Ashton's entire weight on my body, I couldn't be bothered to ponder over Macy's remark. I simply nodded and brought Ashton out of the bar. It took me so much effort just to get him into the car. My back and clothes were completely drenched in sweat by the time I was done. I finally understood why people said pregnant women were fragile. I was about to fall apart just from doing such a menial task. I gazed at the man in the passenger seat. With his eyes closed, he didn't look as frosty as usual. Instead, he looked so peaceful in his sleep. This man was surely favored by the gods. He had such a handsome face, a nice body, and an infinite amount of wealth. He was the cream of the crop. Just as I continued to stare at Ashton, his eyes suddenly flew open, causing my heart to skip a beat. Before Elle could react, the booze and tobacco scent invaded my nostrils as he proceeded to nibble on the tip of my tongue. Why was Ashton kissing me all of a sudden? He was even kissing me so hard that I couldn't breathe. My mind went abuzz and he let go of me only when I was about to run out of air. I stared at Ashton in shock. At this very moment, he didn't have his usual cold gaze. Instead, there was a complicated look in his eyes, albeit unfathomable as usual. Ashton, I want my child back, he spat out frigidly before leaning into his seat and shutting his eyes once again. I was speechless. Unsure whether he had fallen asleep or was just resting his eyes, I decided to just start the engine and drive back to the villa. Yet, the same words played in my mind like a loop. I want my child back. Was he actually not rejecting this child? The thought of this gave me mixed feelings. At the end of the day, Rebecca was someone he had to look after for the rest of his life. Even if he didn't actually like her, there was no way he would ever leave her be. Chapter 25. Things would only get more complicated if he were to find out the truth. The situation between the three of us would worsen with the addition of this child. Hence, I figured that leaving was the best option, a win-win situation for everyone. I grew frantic upon parking outside the villa. Taking Ashton upstairs was not going to be an easy task. After contemplating for a moment, I alighted the vehicle, walked toward the passenger seat and opened the car door. Ashton, I called out while tugging at his sleeve. Ashton instantly woke up upon hearing his name. His stomach was probably giving him a hard time from all the whiskey he had drunk. The man slowly opened his eyes and glanced at me before scanning his surroundings. You brought me here. I nodded, unsure if he was already sober or still drunk. Come on down. It's late. It was already almost dawn by now. Being pregnant, I simply didn't have the energy to stay up with him. Ashton sat up straight, showing no intention of getting down the car. His dark eyes appeared harmless, but I knew he was in a volatile mood. After giving it some thought, I eventually spoke up. Do you want me to help you get down? I'm going to bask in the sun for a while, he answered and sat there motionlessly. I was completely taken aback. Bask in the sun. Now, how drunk is he? Okay. Take your time. Feeling too awful to stay with him outside, I headed into the villa. I returned to the bedroom and lay in bed. Then, the silence coming from the living room began to fill me with concern. What if he decided to head outside and got into an accident? After struggling with my own thoughts, I got up and headed downstairs. To my surprise, Ashton was already lying on the couch in the living room. I could finally sleep in peace. After such a long night, I fell into a deep slumber and only woke up at noon. With an appointment with Caleb in mind, I hurriedly washed up and headed out the door. By the time I arrived at work, Caleb was already waiting for me at the office. He smiled apologetically upon seeing me. Sorry to bother you at work, Mrs. Stovall. Having just rushed over, I calmed my breathing and had Stacy pour Caleb a glass of water. Then, we signed both the completion and transfer agreements. After we were done, Caleb offered, It's already noon. I suppose you haven't had lunch, Mrs. Stovall. How about a meal together? My wife's been wanting to thank you. Do you happen to have some time? I didn't actually have other plans, but I noticed Stacy gazing at me as though she had something to tell me. Hence, I smiled and turned the man down. You're too kind, Dr. Ludwig. I should be the one thanking you both. I'm afraid I have something to take care of today, so let's meet up another time instead. Hearing that, Caleb left after exchanging some pleasantries. Then, I turned to Stacy. Mr. Fuller wants you to see him at his office, Mrs. Stovely, she said. See him. I furrowed my brows, feeling stunned. Has our department done anything wrong recently? Ashton normally wouldn't summon me over personal affairs while at work. Unless the issue was work-related. Stacy nodded. Finance has approached Mr. Fuller regarding the issue with Dr. Ludwig. Mr. Fuller seems rather unhappy about it and wants you to drop by the president's office. Okay, I answered and headed to the top floor at once. Ashton's office gave off the same cold, stern vibe that he did. The atmosphere here felt chilly even in the midst of summer. The spacious office area looked frosty and unwelcoming. The door to the meeting room was closed. Joseph caught sight of me. Mr. Fuller is still in a meeting with Mr. Quinn and Dr. Crest, Mrs. Stovall. I nodded while thinking. If Drive Crest is Jared Crest, is Mr. Quinn referring to Joe Quinn? I walked over to the couch and sat down. Glancing at my watch, it was now noon. I had left home in such a rush that I hadn't had anything to eat. Thus, I was now starving. Joseph poured me a glass of water and remarked icily, "Please wait a moment, Mrs. Stovall. Mr. Fuller will be done in about half an hour." I took the glass from him. Brushing aside his cold front, I asked, "Has Mr. Fuller been drinking frequently, Mr. Campbell?" Macy had mentioned that Ashton had been visiting her bar often, so I couldn't help but try to find out why this was happening. Hearing my question, Joseph stilled for a moment before answering, "I guess Mr. Fuller hasn't been in the best mood." Why? There was no way Ashton would get so upset over the child. It usually had something to do with Rebecca. Seeing me gaze at him with curiosity, Joseph coughed lightly. "I'm not too sure either." I fell silent. This guy wasn't being honest. I slowly dozed off. Upon hearing a few people's voices after what felt like forever, I tried my best to sit up straight. Chapter 26. The three men who walked out of the meeting room shifted their gazes over to me. With a slight raise of his brows and purse of his thin lips, Jared muttered a few words to Joseph, causing the latter to glance at me before taking his leave. Ashton's gaze darkened as he stared at me. I had a feeling that he was about to unleash his wrath on me. I hurriedly stood up upon thinking about Caleb. I am more than willing to compensate for all the losses incurred for the past 2 days, Mr. Fuller. Ashton frowned while remaining silent. Instead, it was Joe who began to cause a stir. "You're incredible, Mrs. Stovall. This is a project worth a few billion, and you've managed to incur your own husband a loss of over 10 million in just 2 days. You're being far too generous." His words were dripping with sarcasm. Seeing Ashton remain silent with a grim look on his face, I rolled my eyes at Joe. "You sure are a nosy one, Mr. Quinn." Jared stifled his laughter. With his hands in his pockets, he looked on with innocent eyes as though completely uninvolved. Joe cast him a glare before turning to me, looking dour. "What makes you think you can talk to me like that, Scarlett Stovall?" I really had no intention of wasting my breath talking to Joe. The guy never had anything nice to say to me because he thought I was always getting in between Ashton and Rebecca. Still, we had known each other for a long time, so I chose not to mince my words. "Are you a king who has time travel to the future, Mr. Quinn? If so, I'm afraid only the likes of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar would have the privilege of talking to you. You're from that era too, after all." Joe's face flushed red in anger and he no longer held back his words. Even a dead man has more right to talk to me than you do. To think you'd be wicked enough to kill off your own child. Joe, Jared cut the man off sternly. Ashton and Ms. Stovall have some matters to discuss. I've made a lunch reservation, so let's head over and wait for them there. Then, he turned to me. I believe you haven't had lunch either, Ms. Stovall. Why don't you and Ashton join us later? Before I could turn down his offer, the man left, dragging Joe along with him. Only Ashton and I remained inside the large office. Unsure of how he intended to deal with the matter related to Caleb, I decided to break the ice. I am responsible for what happened. I stayed home to recuperate after the surgery and couldn't stop thinking about the child, so I completely forgot about Dr. Ludwig. Ashton remained gloomy and silent, so I continued. I know, they caused unimaginable losses to the company. I'll be more than willing to resign. Is that how you intend to solve this issue? Ashton suddenly asked. His voice and eyes were so chilly that I felt goosebumps. Yeah, I had it all planned out now that I had a reason to quit. I could finally leave J-City. The tall man stood in front of me, letting out a cold chuckle and engulfing me with his frosty presence. You got rid of the child, signed the divorce papers, and now, you're about to quit your job. What are you up to, Scarlett? My palms began to turn sweaty. I instinctively stepped backward, only to feel Ashton grab me by the waist. Are you planning to leave J-City? He demanded, glaring at me with his sharp eyes. No. Elle immediately denied it. Haven't you been wanting to sign the papers? Now that I've signed them, you're finally free to be with Rebecca. What is there not to like about that? Fine. The man's smirk turned even more frigid as his grip on my waist tightened. You know how much I hate it when others do as they please, Scarlett. Do you think I'd let you off so easily after you killed my child? But you didn't want the child. I frowned, feeling increasingly bewildered. Rebecca kept using it as leverage, so I figured I'd take things into my own hands instead of being coerced into getting an abortion. The air in the office grew even more chilly. As Ashton narrowed his eyes, I had a feeling that this man standing in front of me was like a vicious lion. One wrong move and he'd shred me into pieces. You're a smart one, aren't you? I didn't know what he meant, but I certainly understood it wasn't a compliment. Well, since you've already gotten rid of the child, that's fine. We'll just have another one. With that, he walked away. I remained frozen in place, staring at him in a daze. Perhaps these would have been words of encouragement if they came from a loving husband, but coming from him, they were nothing but crude. What are you waiting for? Let's go, he remarked coldly, turning back to glance at me. In a moment of confusion, I merely grunted a response and trotted over to him. Ashton took me to a huge courtyard with a restaurant within it. Upon entering the yard, a woman in a fancy gown walked toward us. This way, please, Mr. Fuller. Then, she brought us past the yard into a room. There, I spotted Jared and Joe having a chat over some tea. Chapter 27. As the lady left, Ashton walked over to the chair next to them and sat down, his eyes looking blank. Why hasn't the food arrived? Devin needs some time to prepare, answered Jared before turning to me. Are you hungry? After a quick pause, I shook my head. Joe wasn't impressed by how Jared treated me. Why are you acting so fragile? It's just an abortion, for God's sake. Why did we have to go out of our way to get a world-renowned chef like Devin to cook for you? What a waste of his time. Before Jared could stop him, I merely smiled. The view here isn't bad. I'll go take a walk. My words were meant for Ashton and Jared. Ashton gave me a cool glance and said nothing. The courtyard looks stunning. Go take a look, Jared suggested. There's also a bonsai garden with a lake full of fish in the middle. With a smile and word of thanks, I headed outside. Are you insane, Jared? Why are you caring so much about that woman? Have you lost your mind? If she hadn't married Ashton through underhanded means, Rebecca and Ashton would have long been happily married by now. Those words clearly came from Joe. I couldn't help but hear them even if I didn't want to. From how loudly he spoke, pretty much everyone in the building could hear him. Not wanting to hear them anymore, I picked up my pace. It was indeed a different sight as I arrived in the courtyard. Considering how this huge courtyard was located in the heart of a glamorous place like J-City and even had an enormous plot of land for planting an array of greenery, there was no doubt that the owner of this restaurant was filthy rich. As I strolled along the pebble path, I spotted a man in his mid-30s plucking some branches with a child next to him. Upon walking closer, the man noticed me too. "Hello," he greeted, dropping whatever he was doing. I returned a smile. "Hi." The child, who seemed to have just learned how to walk, began trotting over to me. He seems to be quite friendly. Unable to speak, the little boy stared at me wide-eyed and gave me the yellow flower he was holding. I was instantly overjoyed and couldn't help but want to pick him up, only to be stopped by the man. "Be careful. He's a playful one. I don't want you getting hurt while you're pregnant." I stared at the man in disbelief. How did you know I was pregnant?" The question never left my mouth. Still, the man responded, "Don't be surprised. I know a little about medicine and could guess that you're pregnant from the way you subconsciously held your belly while walking." I nodded, feeling amazed by this. "Man, this courtyard is really unique," I remarked. "It's like a vegetable garden." The man couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, to be exact, this is a medicinal herb garden. There are over 2,000 different species of medicinal plants here. They're on the brink of extinction, so they're being cultivated here." Feeling stunned, I glanced at my surroundings carefully. Indeed, there weren't many vegetables here, but there were lots of unrecognizable plants as well as an unusually tall cactus. This place is called Herb Garden. J-City is the most suitable area in the whole country to cultivate these plants, and that's how Herb Garden became the center of our country's medicinal herbs. There aren't many, but every species is being preserved. After sorting out the branches he had plucked, the man began to leave with his child. I nodded, gaining a newfound liking for this place as I watched him and the little boy walk away. Suddenly, the man stopped and called out to me, "Don't hang around too long, Mrs. Fuller. Some herbs here aren't good for the child." Feeling taken aback, I returned to my senses only after they had walked far away. He knew who I was. Soon, Ashton came out and saw me kneeling by a stream looking at ants. "Let's go," he called out, standing next to me. I was so focused on whatever I was doing that I nearly slipped upon hearing his voice. Thankfully, he helped me up with his quick reflexes. "Did you leave your brain at home?" Ashton asked, frowning. I smiled sheepishly. I spaced out. The man turned and walked away without a word. I couldn't help but notice that Ashton had been treating me less coldly for the past 2 days. Following him from behind, I mustered up the courage to ask, "So Herb Garden isn't actually a restaurant?" "Yeah," he answered briefly, clearly not interested in holding a conversation. The man walked so quickly that it didn't take us long to return indoors, and the table was already filled with an array of dishes. Furthermore, apart from the 4 of us, there was now a family of 3 at the table too. It was the man and little boy I had just met, along with a woman, who was the man's wife. The man smiled as he saw me and turned to his wife. "Bring Mrs. Fuller some cuttlefish stew from the kitchen. It's good for the baby." I paused briefly before thanking them. "The baby's already gone. What's the point in serving her that?" Joe muttered resentfully. The way Ashton glanced at me made me feel anxious. Worried that he would infer something from the man's words, I hurriedly turned to him. You haven't introduced me to this man. Chapter 28. From how gently I spoke, I probably sounded like a thoughtful wife. Ashton's gaze on me darkened for a moment before he began to introduce the man briefly. This man happened to be Henry Lowell, the owner of this courtyard and heir of a prominent family of doctors. He was so passionate about medicinal herbs and ingredients that he decided to cultivate them here. The beautiful woman with him was his wife, and the one-year-old child was his son. After a brief exchange of greetings, I felt unsettled. I had been trying too hard to keep my pregnancy a secret from Ashton all this while. What if Henry were to reveal it? Feeling worried, I couldn't help but glance at Jared, hoping he would think of a way to help me. At this moment, Mrs. Lowell returned with the freshly cooked cuttlefish stew and beamed at me. Try some of this, Mrs. Fuller. I loved this when I was pregnant. It may taste a little strange, but my husband added some nourishing herbs into it, so they're especially good for you. How many weeks old is your child? Suddenly feeling panicky, I returned a smile. It was 6 weeks old, but Ashton and I hadn't planned for the child. That's why we decided to get an abortion. The woman was dumbfounded and stared at me, looking rather doubtful. You don't look like. These are just some symptoms of false pregnancy, Mrs. Lowell. She'll be fine as time passes. I can't help but admire you and your husband, though. You're both so experienced that you could tell she was pregnant just by observing her. Jared, who was sipping some tea, finally spoke up. Henry squinted for a moment before smiling and saying nothing more. Mrs. Lowell, on the other hand, still couldn't seem to believe I was merely exhibiting false pregnancy symptoms. After our meal, Henry whispered something into his wife's ear, causing her to glance at me in surprise before nodding and leaving the room. Then, Henry turned to Ashton. Since you've come all the way here, I've prepared some herbs for Mrs. Fuller. If she takes them diligently, it won't be difficult for you both to have another child. Ashton nodded and gazed at me emotionlessly. I couldn't tell what he was up to. But somehow, it felt as though he had specifically brought me over to have Henry take a look at me. As for his reasons, I truly had no idea. Feeling perplexed, I remained silent the whole time until we left. It was already evening by the time we got into the car. Joe couldn't stand the sight of me, so he pestered Ashton to send me home. Knowing they probably still had other matters to take care of, I got down and said I would take a cab. Ashton didn't say much. He merely told me to be careful before leaving with the other 2 men. My mind was filled with all sorts of worrying thoughts that I was unable to sleep at all. I considered approaching Jared, but couldn't as he was surely with Ashton now. With nowhere else in mind, I headed to our bar. The sky had gotten dark and the bar was fairly packed. Macy was utterly shocked to see me. What are you doing here instead of resting at home? She demanded, looking like she wanted to beat me up. Relieving my boredom, I spat out before finding myself a seat. Macy clutched her forehead, seemingly about to explode. You've just had an abortion a few days ago, Ms. Stovall. Can you please take better care of yourself and stay home? Knowing she was worried about me, I turned to her. Give me a glass of orange juice. Let's have a chat. I'm not here to relieve my boredom, she replied before heading to the counter. Despite keeping my eyes on the bar's patrons, I couldn't help but wonder why Ashton had brought me to Herb Garden. Did he possibly suspect that I had kept the child? What are you spacing out about? Didn't you say you were bored to death? Let's go. I'll take you somewhere nice. Macy tapped me on the shoulder and began to drag me outside. I followed her out of the bar in confusion. Where are we going? You'll find out when we get there. The entire street was filled with bars, and I thought she was just taking me out for a stroll. Don't you feel bored taking me out like this instead of watching over your own place? What are you talking about? She pointed at a glamorous-looking nightclub nearby. There are other people looking after my bar. Didn't you say you were bored? Well, I'm about to show you a whole new world. I hardly frequented anywhere else apart from Macy's bar, so my ears instantly felt like they were about to burst from the blaring music playing in the dazzling nightclub. Macy seemed to know this place like the back of her hand. She found a nice spot on the second floor and called the manager over. I want 2 of your men. The manager immediately nodded. Sure. I'll have a selection sent over to you. I turned to Macy in despair. What are you getting male hosts for? To keep us company, of course. She answered matter-of-factly before placing a glass of juice in front of me. Have a look at them and pick anyone you like. They're much more skillful and gentle than Ashton. Don't waste your time thinking about him all day. You should put on an attitude too. Chapter 29. Before I could respond, the manager from earlier returned with over a dozen male models, stunning me into silence. Pick anyone you like. They have every kind of guy imaginable. Don't you like those domineering Mr. CEO types? Take a look at that man in the suit. He looks just as good as Ashton, doesn't he? Macy remarked while choosing a youthful, puppy-like male model. The model seemed awfully experienced. He walked over to Macy and carefully poured her a glass of wine before placing her hand in his. Macy showed no signs of refuting, she merely leaned into his arms. My jaw dropped. Did this woman come here often? No wonder she could never get a boyfriend. What are you staring at us for? Hurry up and choose your guy. Macy urged. Not knowing what to do at all, I smiled. I'm good. Rolling her eyes at me, Macy pointed to the man in the suit. You stay here and keep her company, then. After the other male models left, the man in the suit sat down next to me. I felt especially uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Macy and her guy prepared to leave and have more fun among themselves. With just the 2 of us left here, I turned to the man in the suit and said awkwardly. I'm not. You don't have to explain, miss. I understand, the man responded with a grin. Everyone's like this the first time. You'll get used to it. I had no words. On the other hand, the man readily tried to strike up a conversation. What do you usually enjoy doing, miss? I smiled. I like reading. Well, it's no wonder you give off such a classy vibe. Not knowing what to say, I got up. I have to use the bathroom. I never found the bathroom despite wandering around the club for a long time. Instead, I bumped into a few familiar faces. Rebecca and Joe. The 2 walked side by side, and we met while walking on the same path from opposite sides. I couldn't avoid them even if I wanted to. Rebecca's smile instantly vanished as she saw me, and she turned to Joe. What is she doing here? Joe was surprised too. He shook his head lightly. Ashton told her to go home while we were at Herb Garden. He didn't let her come with us. From their conversation, I could guess that the few of them had intended to meet up here. They probably didn't want me tagging along, which was why they had sent me away back at Herb Garden. Why do you follow Ashton wherever he goes, Scarlett? How shameless could you be? Joe never had anything nice to say to me, so he didn't hold back the moment he opened his mouth. Not bothering to explain in detail, I answered briefly, you think too much. I'm here with a friend. I didn't have the time to stalk Ashton everywhere. Rebecca eyed me from head to toe and narrowed her eyes. Didn't you just get an abortion? What are you doing in a place like this? She's probably sad and lonely. Ashton never touches her, so she has no choice but to find someone else. Joe never knew when to shut up. I frowned, feeling a wave of anger rise within me. You should rinse your mouth when you get home, Mr. Quinn. You're polluting the air. I never liked either of them, so I hastily turned to leave. Yet, Rebecca stood in my way and sneered at me. It's only been a few days since we last met, and you're getting all smart-mouthed again, huh? Have you not signed the divorce papers? You don't think Ash would actually stay with a woman who just lost a child, do you? Feeling increasingly livid, I glared at her coldly and scoffed. Have you already forgotten that you've just lost your child too, Rebecca? You. The woman turned red with fury and swung her arm at me, but I grabbed it in time. If playing innocent is what you're into, you'd better a better job. Ashton's going to hate you if he saw what you just tried to do. With that, I shoved her arm away and prepared to leave. Unexpectedly, Rebecca had decided to set me up. The moment I let go of her, she deliberately stumbled and collapsed against the wall next to he. From far, it looked as though I had pushed her. To make matters worse, Ashton and Jared had just walked over. They saw what just happened. Are you out of your mind, Scarlett? Joe yelled while helping Rebecca up. All she did was say a few words to you. Did you have to do that? A few words. Should I have let her insult me, then? If you have no intention of using your eyes and brain, please give them to someone who needs them, Mr. Quinn. Don't waste what you've been given. I just couldn't understand why Ashton would hang around someone as despicable as this man. With Ashton and Jared watching from the sidelines with their hands in their pockets, I shot a glance at them and got ready to leave without even sparing them a greeting. Yet, Joe decided to grab onto my hand. You're leaving after running your mouth and hitting someone. Were you raised by dogs, Scarlett? Are you mental, Joe? When did I ever push her? You're whining about me running my mouth, but you started it. I was in an awful mood to begin with, so I really didn't want to be involved with this bunch. I began to walk away after breaking free from Joe's grasp. But just when my shoulder touched Ashton's, the latter held me by the wrist, forcing me to stop in my tracks and gaze at him. Chapter 30. The man's face instantly darkened, and his eyes turned frosty. Evidently, he was mad. Can I help you, Mr. Fuller? I didn't feel like I was Ashton's wife at all here, but rather, an outsider. The more I felt this way, the more upset I became. Even the way I gazed at Ashton was full of defiance. Apologize. His tone was completely commanding. My brows creased as rage consumed me. Have you lost it, Ashton? Why the hell should I apologize? You pushed her, he replied grimly in his deep voice. I pushed her. I laughed in anger. You should get your eyes checked, Ashton. Meanwhile, Joe obviously had nothing better to do than to stir things up. So you think you just have to apologize after hitting someone? In that case, I'll kill a guy and say sorry, and everything will be fine. Who needs the law, right? He remarked with a look of disdain. Holy shit. Once again, I resisted the urge to cuss him out. What else do you want from me? I turned to him and asked frostily. He crossed his arms in a matter-of-fact way. We buddies have a rule: whoever messes up has to apologize sincerely and hold a drinking session for everyone. When we're happy, you'll be forgiven. You dipshit. How is that a way to apologize? Knock it off, Joe. Jared, who had been watching the whole time, furrowed his brows. Joe didn't bother looking at him and glanced at Ashton instead. What do you think, Ashton? Ashton's gaze on me darkened, and the crease between his brows deepened. After a long while, he turned to Rebecca. What do you propose we do? Rebecca lowered her head slightly. She spoke softly, but everyone could hear her. Scarlett's your wife, so you decide. You pretentious little bitch. I held it in and turned to Joe. So, where shall we drink? Jared walked up to me and frowned. Have you got no fear? I knew what he meant. I had to be careful since there was another life inside of me. Who knew what would happen if I decided to drown myself in alcohol? Joe obviously didn't want Jared to rain on their parade. Stop meddling, Jared. Let's go, Ms. Stovall. I followed them to their room. As though afraid I wouldn't get knocked out, Joe ordered 10 bottles of whiskey and 2 crates of beer. Think you can handle this, Ms. Stovall? Ha. I wanted to laugh. Does he think this is fun? After filling 10 glasses with beer, Joe said to me, the rule here is that you can get anyone here to drink for you, anyone at all. But that depends on your own abilities. If you can't convince anyone to help you, you'll have to drink everything on your own. Seeing the table full of glasses, I frowned as I subconsciously placed a hand over my belly. Hang in there, my baby, I prayed silently. I picked up a glass and began to drink. Yet, my stomach began to churn from just a few sips. Unable to contain my nausea, I dashed toward the bathroom and reached over the toilet. Jared followed me from behind and stroked my back. Show Ashton your vulnerable side and ask him to help you. You're his wife, after all. He won't let Joe do as he pleases. I smirked coldly. Unlike Rebecca, I wasn't someone who could captivate the hearts of men just by shedding a few tears. Not responding to that, I asked him, is there anything that can reduce the side effects on the baby? He nodded. But drugs are drugs. They can't undo all the harm. That's fine. Please get me some later. I left the bathroom. Joe had put on a song and was casually singing when I made my way back. What's wrong? Can't even handle one glass. Not bothering with him, I glanced at the table. Apart from the glass I had drunk from, all the others remained untouched. Ashton and Rebecca sat close to each other. I watched as the woman muttered something to him, and he responded with a slight nod. The man's gaze darkened upon seeing me, but he soon looked away. Feeling my heart ache, I walked to the table and glanced at Joe. I hope you won't go back on your word, Mr. Quinn.